Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. We have back with us today Dr. Al Kertz of Anthill LLC. And today's topic, Al, we're going to be talking about epidemiology of colostrum in New York Holstein herds. For those of you that are joining us here today, we thank you for taking the time to tune in. If you have any questions, feel free to post them there in the chat area on your screen. Or if you're joining us from social media, simply post your questions in those channels. So, welcome, Dr. Kurtz. Nice to see you.
It's good to be back.
And I know we were talking here at the beginning before we went live. 150 articles, columns, things that you've written for Feedstuffs over the years.
Yes, and you were responsible for me doing that, getting started back in June of 2011. Actually, it was September when we first started doing the columns ever since.
That's incredible. Well, congratulations. That's a milestone for sure. So, today we've got an interesting topic. I'm not going to delay. I'd like you to just go ahead and give us an overview.
Well, Sarah, sometimes it seems like we might have an overemphasis on colostrum because there's a lot of information out there. But on the other hand, there's nothing quite like it and the impact it has. Dr. Sandra Godden of the University of Minnesota Vet College recently did a presentation. She called it liquid gold. So, in a way, it is because it confers immunity on the calf, helps them get through their diarrhea and respiratory issues, and it has long term effects. There are studies that show it affects the lactation, first lactation, and subsequent lactations. But there's so many factors involved in colostrum, and that's one of the reasons why it's still being studied. And in this case, there was a large scale study done of New York Holstein herds by the College of Veterinary Medicine at Cornell, as well as some in the Department of Animal Science. They selected herds from New York based on their participation in previous statewide studies. And so they were kind of, in a sense, pre qualified then, as well as by contacting various veterinarians and nutritionists. The criteria to be included were the ability to collect and record individual colostrum weights or volumes, and a composite sample for Brix percent reading. Minimum herd size of 500 lactating Holstein cows, and use of dairy management software program Dairy Comp 305. And then heifer calves had to be housed on site for at least the first week of life. They started out with a total of 51 farms possible. They were contacted shortly in the fall and early winter before the pandemic. And after the herd owners responded, whether they participated or not, 19 herds were selected and enrolled in the study. Colostrum heel was either collected as a volume or as a weight. And then a Brix refractometer was provided to each dairy, and the employees were taught how to use it. Brix is kind of an indirect measure of the percent solids. And since there's about 24% solids in colostrum, and about 8 to 10 of those units, sometimes more, are IG protein, the Brix refractometer reading is a good index of the quality and the concentration in the colostrum. That's why it's commonly used on dairy farms. In addition to that, they had 2 environmental data loggers on each farm that measured light intensity, ambient temperature, and humidity, so they could calculate that temperature humidity index. And these were done at like 15 and 30-minute intervals. So there's an extensive database and extensive description of how all that was analyzed in the paper. But of course, we're not going to go into all that now. Of the 19 herds in the study, there were over 21,000 individual animal colostrum records collected. The herd size ranged from 620 to 4,600 cows. Most of them in that 1,000 to 2,000 cow per herd size. The medium colostrum yield was 4 liters, with about 25% Brix reading for first calf heifers and 4.6 liters for the subsequent second and subsequent lactations. If we look at the first table, we can see some of those data now. When you look at the herds in terms of when did they feed first colostrum, 95% of them did it within 2 hours of birth. That is just a phenomenal amount. That's the recommended amount, but you don't often find data where it's that high percentage that do that. And of that first colostrum fed, 68% of them did it with esophageal tubing. The reason that's commonly done is because the objective is to get 4 quarts of colostrum into the calf within 2 hours of birth. But the calves won't always eat or drink that much. So many of them will maybe start feeding the colostrum, and if they don't drink at all, they'll tube them using an esophageal tube. There's a little bit of an art and a science to that, so you got to be careful how you do it. Keep it clean and disinfected and so on. So 68% of them use some degree of esophageal tubing. 11% fed by bottle, and 21% did both. So that's something that often happens. The volume fed in the first feeding was 3 quarts and 5%. And again, 95% did 4 quarts, which is ideal. The number of feedings, there were 26% that did 1 feeding, 58% 2 feedings, and then 16% 3 feedings. It's commonly recommended that there be this first feeding of 4 quarts within the first 2 hours, and then another 2 quarts 24 hours later, and that's where the multiple feedings would come from. Okay, let's see. Now let's look at some of the other aspects of what was happening. If we look at some of these bullet points, calf housing by percent of herds was 47% used hutches. Of course, this is a very cold environment, so there's more indoor housing, and 26% had individual pens. That's probably indoor housing. And then 32% by group. That's becoming more common, and typically if there's grouping, there's 2 in a larger size hutch, 2 calves per unit. The amount of milk, or the type of milk fed to pre-wean calves by percent of herds was 21% fed milk replacer, 11% acidified waste milk, which surprised me. I didn't realize there was that much of that still being fed. 12% fed pasteurized, or 37% fed pasteurized waste milk, which is more common, and 11% each for raw waste milk, not recommended, pasteurized whole milk, or raw whole milk. Now, if you add those numbers together, you'll end up with over 100%. And that's because most herds do a combination of feeding. And that's really shown in the 2014 National Animal Health Monitoring Survey that was last done in 2014. So now if we look at the data in table 2, we'll see some of the different dimensions. So for instance, the first parity, the first lactation, the mean weight of colostrum was 10.4 pounds. Now remember that the mean volume was about 4 liters. So a gallon of water, for instance, is about 8.5 pounds. So here you've got a gallon of 10.4, and that's because it's got about 24% solids. Now the other thing I want to call attention to is look at the standard deviation. 6.4 out of 10.4. I like to use the coefficient of variation, which roughly is calculating 6.4 divided by 10.4 converted to a percent. So that says that 64, that the standard deviation was 64% of the mean. That tells you there's a lot of variation. There's quite a wide range. So it's not just the average, but it's the variation. And then the amount in the second parity, second lactation, was 13.3. So it's higher. Again, it's got a lot of variation, 8.3. But that's the highest amount. And then it's 12, 12.3, and 12.5, again with high variation. So even though the amounts look pretty set, there's a lot of variation in that. And then the Brix percent, which you remember is the rough estimate of the solids in the colostrum. You see that it's fairly similar, 25% roughly in the first two lactations. And then it goes a little bit higher in the third lactation. In the fourth lactation, you got up to almost 27%. In the fifth, 27 or a little bit higher. Notice that the variation in terms of standard deviation is much lower than it is on volume. Now, at times I've gotten questions as to why cows don't provide any colostrum or a very low amount. And that's been puzzling. In this study, they found that only 3.1% of first calf heifers had low or no colostrum, and a little bit more, 5.5% of older cows. So again, they have a lot of data. They did a lot of statistical analysis. So when they looked at these cows, they found the following bullet points. The number, when they had a low volume of colostrum or none at all, it was slightly lower for stillbirths, slightly lower for longer than 47-day dry periods. Not sure why. Slightly higher when there was over 28,800 pounds of 305-day milk, and higher if there was 273-day greater pregnancy length, and they were greater when there was less than 13.2 pounds colostrum yield, which I don't understand because it's going to be less since they have low or none, and then greater for first lactation. So it's hard to make sense of this. These are associations, and they may not be cause and effect, and you have a lot of data and you pick up some differences like that, which maybe you can't figure out what they mean. So they also found that 1/5 of the cows produce colostrum below the industry standard. So that is an IgG concentration of equal to or greater than 50 grams per liter, or a Brix reading equal to or greater than 22%. So 1/5 of the cows produce more than that, or better quality than that, which is not a real high percentage when that is the standard. Now, cows with female calves had lowest colostrum yield, and birth weights were not available in this study. But in other studies, such as one I was involved in 1997, we found that male calves typically had about 7% greater body weight. So that might have some relation to why female calves had less colostrum yield. Decreased colostrum yield and Brix percent occurred with stillbirths in older cows. And then previous lactation greater than about 35,000 pounds was associated with a lower Brix percent and greater colostrum yield, but these differences were relatively small. Then the last category that the authors addressed was some limitations with this study. The first one is that the average herd size was of 1,545 cows versus an average herd size in the state of New York of 172 cows. So that's a very different association. So it tells you these data are more likely related to these sets of circumstances, including the fact that these were much larger herds than the average in the state. And of these 19 herds, they volunteered to participate in the study. So you're getting herds that are going to be very outgoing and looking for information and learning more about their operation. So they're the ones that probably are doing a better job to start with and want to even know more about their operation and to do a better job. So they, you have herds that are willingly and readily participating in that story. And then they did find small statistical differences which may not have any biological sense at all. And then there's difficult to make a cause and effect in these studies because they're relationships that are established. So when you look at all of that, you'd have to say, well, these herds were the cream of the crop. They're probably doing an exceptional job to start with. And so these data apply to herds like that. But they still can provide some clues as to some areas maybe are worth following up on and determining more about how we could learn more about colostrum in herds in the U.S.
Very good, Al. So you mentioned better managed herds. What do you think? What do you speculate might be the results if the herds are not so well managed? If we didn't randomly, volunteer to take these ones that were volunteers and they're probably better managed, what do you think we'd be seeing?
I think you'd find that they don't have as good of an operation because one of the things that has to happen, you have to have really good detailed records when calves are born, who takes care of them, how soon they get colostrum in, how it's prepared, how it's administered. And in this case, these herds also had employees sign off or initial what they did because calving is a 24-hour cycle. And so you got to have crews on hand for throughout 24 hours to take care of the calves when they're born. And that means you got many different people who are handling things. So unless there's a good comprehensive protocol, which is followed consistently, and good data collection, then when something doesn't go right, you don't have a good idea what didn't go right. So a lot of times herds will take blood samples, look at blood antibody levels as an indicator of how well is colostrum administered. So if herds don't do that, then they don't know how well the colostrum might be administered. So this is partly related to size because as they're larger size operations, you can have more specialized employees and protocols to follow. But you can also find larger herds that don't do a good job or don't do as good a job as these herds in this case obviously did. So it's a very complex situation.
A reminder to post any questions that you might have for Dr. Kertz, and we'll get to those. Also, if you haven't already seen it, we have posted for you Dr. Kertz's column, and that can be found in the chat. There's a link, and that will take you to the November digital issue of Feedstuffs, which just deployed this week, and you will be able to read that column if you would like. So very interesting information, Dr. Kertz. And as always, we like to ask, what would you say then is the bottom line in all of this?
The bottom line is no matter what size dairy, you have to have a really good focus on calving and colostrum management because that's really going to determine how well that calf grows and how well that calf later produces milk. And if you don't have a good protocol and follow it consistently, you won't get as good of results out of the investment you have in that calf. And that's the reason to do that. Now, we're going to do a follow-up next month because there's another whole dimension of this study that we'll cover.
Very good. Look forward to that. So stay tuned, folks. We'll be coming to you in December. It would be with that follow-up. Thank you, Dr. Kertz, for your insight and your time here today. As always, we appreciate you joining us. Thank you all too for joining us and for tuning in. A couple of reminders. Feedstuffs 365 is now part of feedstuffs.com. So you can simply go to our website and you can view all of our Feedstuffs 365 interviews in live and in on demand. So you might want to check that out. A couple of programming notes. Tomorrow, we will be talking about improving milk production and reducing emissions with canola meal. So, another dairy focused topic for you. And then Thursday, we have a very special global discussion on antimicrobial use stewardship principles for the broiler industry and the commitments that the private sector is making in an effort to combat antimicrobial resistance. There's a very significant initiative going on there. So we are joined with some folks from around the world to discuss that. Lots of good stuff ahead still this week. Until next time for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.